Thank you. Thank you for coming out early on a Sunday morning. Thank you for everyone on live stream. And thank you, Stephen, for bringing me out all the way from Los Angeles. I consider myself a nutrition myth debunker. That's really my job title. And the reason for this, I love my job title, I'll tell you why. But the reason for this is that nutrition is so confusing. I would argue that nutrition is the most complicated of the sciences. For instance, chemistry. You've got some hydrogens, you've got some oxygens, put them together, you get some water. Very straightforward. You know, there's a lot of consensus among chemists. Or anatomy, you've got a lot of structures and functions, and it changes over time with the new technology and the new information that we gain. But overall, there's generally a nice consensus. Math, 2 + 2, always 4, no matter how you look at it. Nutrition has way more levels than that, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why it is so complicated. First of all, it's very difficult to study. So ideally, you would take thousands of people with all sorts of different ethnicities and gender and stick them in one little city when they were born. And you would monitor them for life, watch every single thing they eat, follow their biochemical parameters, follow their long-term health outcomes for decades, and we would gather a lot of information. But I'm not going to sign up for a study like that. Do you want to be watched every meal you eat? And who's going to fund that? So instead, we rely on all sorts of different types of data. We look at, for instance, a nutrient and what it does to the biochemistry in your body. We'll do like a randomized controlled trial, for instance, with 2 populations with similar levels of type 2 diabetes, and give them diet A compared to diet B, and watch their hemoglobin A1C and watch how their health parameters come about. We'll look at population studies, and we'll look at dietary patterns, look at the blue zones. We look at kind of all these different types of studies, and we put it all together into this giant database. And then we make conclusions based on the preponderance of evidence, which is where the second reason nutrition is so complex comes in: interpretation. If you go onto Dr. Google any time of day, you'll find 1,000 opinions on every subject within nutrition. We're going to talk about one of the hot topics now, saturated fat, but it just goes on and on and on. Everyone has an opinion on nutrition, particularly when you tell them you're on a plant-based diet, right? How many of you have heard that, where it's like, well, where do you get your fill-in-the-blank nutrient? We're going to talk about all that. There's so much. Everyone's an expert in nutrition when you tell them you're on a plant-based diet specifically. Add to that the billions and billions and bazillions of dollars that the food industry is vested in you eating their food. This starts all the way in preschool. I have little kids, and I remember preschool. I'll show you a picture. On the wall in the cafeteria, there's a big, strong athlete and a beautiful, famous singer, and the milk mustache on their milk, on their mouths. And it starts that conversation from day one. It plants seeds. All the way through medical school, nutrition school. My information was literally in small print at the bottom, sponsored by the Dairy Council. Very small print where you can't see it. I sat in on my husband's medical school nutrition class, and it was basically, you could see that information is just not there. All the way to right now, I can get free continuing education units if I go to something sponsored by the food industry. And continuing education units are expensive. So it goes all the way from childhood through education, all the way to the government. How many of you followed the 2015 dietary guidelines drama? Yes, it was amazing. This was the first time I really delved in with this because I was part of groups that were trying to sustain some of the information that came out. So every 5 years, the USDA and the HHS come up with new dietary guidelines. So before they do so, they enlist a very academic group, a scientific advisory committee filled with researchers, scientists, physicians, and they analyze all of the information that's come out in the last 5 years. What's the state of the nation? What could we do better? What do we need to do? And they come up with a report. And this report was 500+ pages. It was very in-depth. And then based on that, the USDA and HHS comes to their ultimate conclusions. Well, this was the first time that this report wanted to put in the guidelines that meat is unsustainable. They would not have that. And if you saw the uproar from the meat industry to prevent that statement from ever being put into action so that we can see this, because, by the way, the dietary guidelines are what governs what foods are offered at WIC, what foods are offered for the USDA school lunch and breakfast programs. It dictates what we see as nutrition advice, the overarching nutrition advice. Well, it didn't make it into the guidelines, needless to say. And unfortunately, this happens all the time. Money and power is very, very, very prominent in terms of what we hear in terms of nutrition. So that's just basic nutrition. That's just nutrition. Take it to the next level. Add to that the information that we're gathering about the imminent depletion of global resources, water, land. I live in California, as I mentioned last night, and I've been there my entire life, and I've witnessed the effects of this drought. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's very scary. We haven't seen real rain, even though they predicted El Nino last year. So there are massive changes and massive depletion coming from the livestock industry and producing animals for food. Similarly, there is so much evidence showing that the #1 cause of climate change is livestock production, more so than all transportation combined. And this is based on the World Health Organization's assessment several years ago, I think 2006. Add to that this antibiotic superbug phenomenon we have. So the CDC estimates that about 2 million people were sickened every year and 23,000 die every year. This was in 2013. There was an article that came out, I don't know if you saw it last week, about, and I think it was New York Times, about how we're not even reporting all of these superbug infections. Essentially, we're using so many antibiotics that these bacteria have evolved and surpassed, and they are able to survive it. And people are sickened and dying from this. Well, guess what? 70 to 80% of all antibiotics used in the United States goes to healthy animals on factory farms to prevent them from spreading disease and to save money. Add to that, the horrible, worst icing on the cake, if proverbial, if you would say, is the fact that 124,000 land animals are brutally slaughtered every single day around the world to end up on the plate. So you add all of this information together, and food is no longer just, what am I in the mood to eat? And it's more so than, is this good for me or not good for me? There are global epidemic issues, and it is everything is at stake right now, and it is really important. So because of this, nutrition gets exponentially more complicated. I want to tell you a little story about my journey. When I was a teenager, I read John Robbins' Diet for a New America. And how many of you read that book? When I read that book, I was shattered. I'm sure some of you were as well, because I had no idea how food ended up on my plate. And it was devastating and shocking. And what do you do with that information? Well, I didn't know any vegetarians at the time. My mom was the house chef, and I wasn't familiar in the kitchen yet. So I didn't know what to eat. I didn't know, there was no internet. I'm dating myself. There was no social media yet. I couldn't go on Facebook and ask my friends, well, what should I eat? And it was hard to maintain and get some information, good information. So I did my best. I would eat granola bars and fruit rolls, again, dating myself. And of course, my parents were worried about me. They're good parents, and they saw that, what is she eating? She's eating side dishes, and how is she going to be okay? So they enlisted their friend that they knew in the healthcare industry, Candy. We're still friends today. And the story actually gets funny with her, but she is a nurse. And she was taught as a nurse to teach what we're taught in graduate school, even for nutrition, about you're going to be protein deficient, you're going to be iron deficient. And they staged what I like to refer to as my intervention, because they took me to a steakhouse and proceeded to order me a teriyaki steak with a pineapple ring on top, and told me how deficient I was going to be in all of these nutrients. Well, I got scared. It's scary. I was young. I wanted to be healthy and strong and have a life I wanted to live and be healthy, as many of us do, most of us do. But I'll never forget that first bite of steak. And as I wrote about this in Vegetarian Diet, as I put my fork in that steak, you can't unknow what you know. And that first bite, I knew too much, and I knew all I saw was a face, and I saw what was happening, and it just killed me. But how many of you are familiar with Dr. Melanie Joy's work? She wrote Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and We're Cows. We're Cows, and she has this amazing TED Talk. Highly recommended work. She coined the term carnism, and the idea that eating meat is normal, natural, and necessary. And so that's, I got acculturated back. I was able to go back to eating regular, standard American, healthy diet. And I kept reading because I knew in my heart of hearts that how could something be so horrible to the planet that we live on? How could something cause immense suffering in thousands and billions of animals and be good for me. Like, it didn't make sense, it didn't resonate with me. So I kept reading and reading, knowing that there has to be something bigger than this. And it took, flash forward to many years of a degree in nutrition and finally realizing that, wait a second, not only can I get my protein from plants, but it's packaged better. And not only can I get iron from plants, but you get a better source, a safer source of iron from plant foods. So ultimately, I was very happy to see the symbiotic trifecta take place. That what is good for the planet, what is good to prevent cruelty is also good for me. Not only can we survive on a plant-based diet, but the research is increasingly showing that we can indeed thrive on a plant-based diet. So I think we could sit here all day if we wanted to. So just to say, I love my job as a myth debunker. I wish I had a myth debunker that I knew when I was a kid and wanted to do this. I love that I work with people now that come to me, their kids see this information and want their family to go plant-based, and I get to help them now, and the parents that want to make their families plant-based. So it's such an honor for me to have this, to talk about this information. So like I said, we could talk all day about all of the myths that surround nutrition and plant-based nutrition specifically. But since we're limited in time, I selected my favorite topics. One is, of course, the very pervasive one that plant-based diets are suboptimal nutritionally. We're going to tackle saturated fat, and butter is back. This is one of my biggest pet peeves, that protein is a food group, carbs is a food group, fat is a food group, or they're not. We're going to talk about that. And then the idea that our bones are going to dissolve without dairy. A lot of us feel that way. We are taught to think that way. And we'll end on a fun, delicious note that plant-based diets are restrictive. That they're not. That's the myth.